On a freezing January morning in 2000, a social outreach worker named Patricia Mendez made her rounds through the sprawling homeless encampment beneath the Morrison Bridge in Portland, Oregon. She had seen hundreds of faces over the years, heard countless stories of hardship and survival, but nothing prepared her for what she would discover inside the worn green tent, belonging to a man she knew only as Raymond Deshawn Miller had been a fixture in Portland's street community for nearly 8 years. He slept rough, collected bottles, stood in soup kitchen lines, and wore the same tattered coat through winter after winter. To everyone who knew him, he was just another casualty of economic hardship, a middle-aged black man who had fallen through society's cracks. Social workers tried to help him. Police officers who patrolled the area knew him by name. Other homeless individuals shared their cigarettes and spare change with him. What none of them knew was that Raymond Miller was living on top of a fortune. Beneath the sleeping bag where he rested each night, hidden inside a specially constructed false bottom of his tent, lay approximately $1.6 million in cash. The money was vacuum sealed in plastic, wrapped in layers of waterproof material, and carefully arranged to remain flat and undetectable. For 8 years, Miller had slept on this secret, maintaining the most elaborate and disciplined disguise in Portland's criminal history. The money came from a heist that had baffled investigators since April 1992, when Miller walked out of the Northwest Regional Casino counting room with $1.8 million in a sophisticated theft that took less than 12 minutes to execute. He had been the casino's assistant finance manager, a trusted employee with complete access to the counting procedures and security protocols. After the theft, he simply vanished, leaving behind his apartment, his car, and every trace of his former life. On that January morning in 2000, Patricia Mendez had come to check on Ray because a brutal ice storm was forecast. She wanted to convince him to spend a few nights in a shelter. When she found him unresponsive in his tent, suffering from severe hypothermia, she called 911 and began emergency procedures. In moving his belongings to make room for the paramedics, she felt something unusual beneath the tent's floor. The texture was wrong, too rigid, too uniform. By the time the ambulance arrived, Patricia had discovered what would become one of the most shocking revelations in Portland law enforcement history. The homeless man they had been trying to help for years had been hiding in plain sight, living on a fortune while enduring genuine hardship, all to escape justice. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Raymond Deshawn Miller's life before the heist painted the picture of a man who should have had everything. Born in 1957 in Detroit, Michigan, he grew up in a working-class family where his father worked at a Ford assembly plant and his mother cleaned houses. Raymond was brilliant with numbers, earning a full scholarship to Wayne State University, where he studied accounting and finance. He graduated in 1979 with honors and immediately found work at a Detroit bank. For 13 years, Miller built a respectable career in finance. He married his college sweetheart, Denise, in 1981, and they had 2 daughters. The family lived in a modest home in Southfield, a comfortable Detroit suburb. Raymond was known as reliable, quiet, and meticulous. His managers praised his attention to detail and his ability to spot discrepancies in financial records that others missed. But in 1990, everything began to unravel. Denise was diagnosed with breast cancer. The medical bills mounted despite their insurance. Miller took out a second mortgage on their home. He borrowed from his retirement account. When Denise died in January 1991, Miller was left with over $200,000 in debt, 2 grieving teenage daughters, and a crushing sense of failure. He felt he had let his wife down by not being able to afford experimental treatments that might have saved her life. Overwhelmed and unable to face his daughters with the truth about their financial situation, Miller made a decision that would alter his life forever. In August 1991, he accepted a job offer from the Northwest Regional Casino in Portland, Oregon. He told his daughters he needed a fresh start and promised to send for them once he was settled. They went to live with Denise's sister in Cleveland. Miller sent them money each month, calling regularly, maintaining the facade that he was building a new life. The Northwest Regional Casino was a gleaming establishment on the eastern outskirts of Portland. Built in 1988 during the early expansion of Native American gaming operations, the casino employed over 400 people and brought in millions of dollars weekly. Miller was hired as an assistant finance manager, responsible for overseeing the counting room operations and ensuring proper documentation of all cash handling procedures. Within 6 months, Miller had gained complete trust from his supervisors. He understood every aspect of the casino's financial operations, every security measure, every shift change, every blind spot in the surveillance system. He knew when the counting room held the most cash, typically after major weekend events and holiday periods. He knew the timing of armored car pickups. He understood the protocols for emergency procedures. Most importantly, he knew that on the third Friday of each month, the casino held excess cash reserves in the counting room overnight because the armored car company charged premium rates for weekend pickups. This meant that one night each month, the counting room contained not just the daily take, but also reserves meant for operational contingencies, sometimes totaling more than $2 million. Miller began planning in January 1992. He studied the patterns, made notes about camera angles, learned the schedules of every security guard, and identified the 12-minute window between guard rotations when he could move through certain corridors without being observed by personnel, only by cameras that he knew how to manipulate. On Friday, April 17, 1992, Miller executed his plan with surgical precision. The casino had hosted a major boxing match viewing party that night, and the counting room was processing the largest take they had seen in months. Miller worked his normal shift, staying late as he often did, reviewing documentation and preparing weekend reports. At 11:47 p.m., during the shift change, he initiated a false security alert at the casino's north entrance by triggering a door alarm he had subtly damaged earlier in the week. The security response was exactly as he predicted. Guards rushed to investigate the alarm, leaving the counting room area temporarily understaffed. Miller, who had authorized access, entered the counting room using his security card. The cameras captured him entering, but he was supposed to be there. He appeared to be conducting a routine check. Inside, he moved with practiced efficiency. Miller had brought a large rolling case, the type used by casino employees to transport documents between departments. Over the previous weeks, he had gradually brought in vacuum seal bags, hiding them in various locations within the counting room during his normal duties. Now he retrieved them and began filling them with stacks of $100 bills. The counting room maintained meticulous records, but Miller knew those records wouldn't be reconciled until Monday morning. He also knew exactly which stacks of currency had already been counted and documented for the weekend report, versus which stacks were the reserve cash that wouldn't be officially logged until the following week. He took only from the reserve supply, knowing this would delay the discovery. At 11:59 p.m., Miller exited the counting room, the rolling case appearing normally full of documents. He walked calmly through the corridors he had mapped, timing his movements to coincide with camera blind spots during guard rotations. At 12:03 a.m., he reached the employee parking lot, loaded the case into his 1987 Honda Accord, and drove away. Miller didn't go home. He drove directly to a storage unit he had rented 3 months earlier under a false name, paying cash for a year in advance. There, he had already prepared supplies for what would come next. Old clothing, camping gear, toiletries, and detailed maps of Portland's homeless services and encampments. He transferred the money from the rolling case into a military surplus duffel bag he had modified with a false bottom. By 3:00 a.m., Miller had abandoned his Honda in a long-term parking lot at Portland International Airport, making it appear he had fled by plane. He took a taxi to within 2 miles of downtown Portland, then walked the rest of the way, arriving at the Burnside Bridge area just as the city was beginning to wake. Raymond Deshawn Miller, assistant finance manager, ceased to exist. In his place emerged Ray, a homeless man, with a heavy duffel bag and a story about losing his job and his home. The casino discovered the theft at 9:15 a.m. on Monday morning, April 20th, 1992. Senior finance manager Thomas Whitmore arrived for the weekly reconciliation and immediately noticed discrepancies in the cash reserves. Within an hour, they had confirmed that $1.8 million was missing. By noon, the Portland Police Bureau and the FBI had been notified. Investigators initially focused on the possibility of an organized crew. The sophistication of the theft suggested multiple participants and inside knowledge. When they traced the timing and access logs, Raymond Miller's name surfaced immediately. His security card had been used to enter the counting room during the critical time window. Portland police detectives arrived at Miller's apartment at 2:30 p.m. that afternoon. His landlord let them in. The apartment was neat, sparsely furnished, and completely abandoned. Miller's clothes were gone. His toiletries were missing, but his furniture remained, along with his television and kitchen supplies. It appeared he had packed only what he could carry and left everything else behind. His Honda was found at the airport 3 days later. Investigators theorized that Miller had flown out of Portland, possibly to Mexico or Canada. They checked passenger manifests for the entire weekend, but found no record of Raymond Miller. They circulated his photograph to airlines, border crossings, and bus stations across the western United States. Miller's daughters, interviewed by FBI agents in Cleveland, were devastated. They told investigators their father had been sending them money regularly, about $800 per month, and calling every Sunday evening. The last call had come on April 12th, 5 days before the theft. He had sounded normal, asking about their grades and their lives with their aunt. They had no idea he was planning anything. The investigation expanded nationally. Miller's face appeared on wanted posters. The FBI tracked his financial records, interviewed his former colleagues in Detroit, and followed leads from Portland to Miami. They found nothing. Raymond Miller had simply vanished with $1.8 million, and the trail went cold within weeks. What investigators never imagined was that Miller had never left Portland at all. The transformation Raymond Miller underwent was both physical and psychological, and it began the moment he stepped away from that taxi in the pre-dawn hours of April 18th, 1992. He had spent months preparing for this moment, but nothing could truly prepare him for the reality of homelessness. Miller had chosen this disguise for several reasons, all carefully calculated. First, homeless individuals are largely invisible to law enforcement unless they commit crimes. Second, the homeless community is transient and doesn't ask questions about people's pasts. Third, living homeless meant no paper trail, no addresses, no official records that could be traced. Fourth, and most importantly, no one would ever suspect a man living in genuine poverty of having access to a fortune. His first weeks on the streets were brutal. Miller had deliberately chosen not to ease into homelessness with cheap motels or temporary housing. He understood that authenticity required commitment. He slept in doorways, under bridges, in the corners of parking garages. He learned where the soup kitchens were located, when they served meals, and how to navigate the social hierarchies of street life. He let his appearance deteriorate naturally. His hair grew long and unkempt. His beard became scraggly. He stopped bathing regularly, understanding that the smell of the streets would make him forgettable to the general public. He wore the same clothes day after day, letting them become genuinely dirty and worn. He developed a slight shuffle in his walk, a habit of talking to himself, mannerisms that made people look away. Miller chose the Morrison Bridge encampment as his primary location in June 1992, 2 months after the theft. The area beneath the bridge had become home to dozens of individuals, a semi-permanent community with its own rules and social structure. Miller, introducing himself simply as Ray, told people he had lost his job as a janitor and couldn't keep up with rent. It was a common story, believable and unremarkable. The money remained his constant burden and his greatest secret. Miller had initially kept the entire $1.8 million in the storage unit, but he quickly realized he needed access to cash for daily survival without making repeated trips that might establish a pattern. He began the elaborate process of creating his hiding place, using money from the storage unit. Miller purchased a high-quality camping tent from an outdoor supply store, paying cash and wearing a baseball cap to obscure his face. Over several nights in an isolated corner of Forest Park, he carefully modified the tent's floor, creating a false bottom using waterproof materials and rigid plastic sheeting. The modification was ingenious. From inside the tent, the floor appeared normal, slightly padded but not unusual for someone trying to stay comfortable while sleeping on concrete. He transferred approximately $1.6 million into this hiding place, keeping the remaining $200,000 in the storage unit as a reserve. The money in the tent was vacuum sealed in packages of $50,000 each, wrapped in layers of plastic, and arranged to distribute weight evenly. When he slept on top of it, there was no unusual bulk, no obvious irregularity. Miller's daily routine became ritualized to maintain his cover. He woke each morning around dawn, regardless of weather. He visited the Sisters of Mercy soup kitchen on Burnside Street for breakfast 3 or 4 times per week, deliberately varying his pattern to avoid becoming too predictable at any single location. He collected bottles and cans, actually redeeming them for small amounts of cash that he used for tobacco and occasional meals. This activity served multiple purposes. It gave him a reason to move around the city, it provided legitimate small amounts of money, and it reinforced his homeless identity. He attended the Hooper Detox Center's daily lunch program on Tuesdays and Thursdays. He visited the Blanchet House for dinner several evenings each week. He used the public library bathrooms for basic hygiene. He showered at the Portland Rescue Mission once or twice weekly. Every action, every movement reinforced the reality of his poverty. The psychological toll was immense. Miller was an educated man who had once managed millions of dollars in legitimate operations. Now he stood in soup kitchen lines, endured the contempt and pity of passers-by, and lived with genuine cold, hunger, and discomfort. He had to witness violence in the homeless camps, had to navigate the dangers of street life, had to maintain his disguise even when every instinct screamed at him to access his hidden fortune and escape. He thought constantly about his daughters. He could not contact them without risking exposure. They believed he had abandoned them, that he had committed a terrible crime and run away. This knowledge ate at him daily, but he understood that any contact could lead investigators to him. The sacrifice of their relationship was part of the price he paid. Miller's discipline regarding the money was extraordinary. He accessed the storage unit only 4 times in 8 years, always in the middle of the night, always taking elaborate precautions. He would leave his tent around 2 ONCM, walk through the city using different routes each time, and approach the storage facility from varying directions. He kept visits brief, never more than 15 minutes, taking only what cash he needed for the next year or 2. He spent the money with extreme caution. Once every few months, he would take a Greyhound bus to Seattle or Eugene, clean himself up in a public restroom, and make small purchases at different stores, spreading out transactions to avoid suspicion. He bought replacement camping gear, warm clothing, durable boots, and prepaid phone cards that he used sparingly to call his daughters from payphones, blocking his number and keeping conversations brief. To his daughters, he maintained the fiction that he was living somewhere under an assumed identity. Too ashamed to tell them where or how, he sent them money orders from different cities, never establishing a pattern. By 1995, both daughters had graduated high school and started college with money he sent anonymously through their aunt. They believed it came from their mother's life insurance, a fiction their aunt maintained to protect them. There were numerous close calls over the years. In August 1993, Portland police conducted a sweep of the Morrison Bridge encampment, searching for a wanted fugitive. Officers looked inside Miller's tent while he stood outside watching. They saw only camping gear and personal items. They never detected the fortune beneath the floor. In March 1995, a violent fight broke out in the encampment, and the tent next to Miller's was set on fire. The flames came within feet of his shelter. He managed to drag his tent away from the danger, but the incident terrified him. He realized that everything he had endured could be destroyed in moments by circumstances beyond his control. Social worker Patricia Mendez first encountered Miller in November 1996. She was struck by how he seemed different from many homeless individuals, more articulate when he chose to speak, his eyes revealing an intelligence that didn't match his circumstances. She tried repeatedly to help him find housing, to get him into programs, to assist with job placement. Miller always politely declined, maintaining that he preferred to live independently. In January 1998, Miller suffered from a serious respiratory infection that nearly killed him. Patricia convinced him to go to the emergency room at Emmanuel Hospital. He registered using only his first name and gave no social security number. The hospital treated him and released him with antibiotics that he never picked up because he had no way to pay. He survived through sheer determination and the care of other homeless individuals who shared their medicine and food. The FBI had long since moved his case to their cold case division. Portland detectives occasionally reviewed the file, hoping for new leads, but the trail had gone completely cold. The prevailing theory was that Miller had fled to Central or South America and was living comfortably on his stolen fortune. No one imagined he was sleeping rough under a bridge in the same city where he had committed his crime. Miller himself had begun to wonder if he could maintain this life indefinitely. He was 42 years old in 1999, but he looked 60. The harsh years of street living had aged him dramatically. His health was deteriorating from poor nutrition, exposure, and stress. He had persistent back pain from sleeping on the ground. His teeth were failing. He suffered from chronic bronchitis, yet he remained committed to his disguise. In some ways, it had become more than a disguise. The suffering he endured felt like penance for abandoning his daughters and betraying the trust of his employers. The money beneath his tent represented both his salvation and his prison. The brutal winter of late 1999 and early 2000 was one of the worst in Portland's recent history. Temperatures dropped into the teens, unprecedented for the normally mild climate. Ice storms battered the city. The homeless population suffered terribly, with several deaths from exposure reported in December and January. Patricia Mendez intensified her outreach efforts, desperately trying to convince people to accept shelter during the dangerous weather. On January 12, 2000, she made her rounds through the Morrison Bridge encampment as another ice storm approached. She found Raymond Miller, the man she knew as Ray, in his tent, barely conscious. Miller had developed severe hypothermia over several days of sub-freezing temperatures. He had refused to leave his tent, couldn't leave it, because of what lay hidden beneath him. Now his body was shutting down, his core temperature dangerously low. Patricia immediately called 911 and began emergency warming procedures. She needed to get him out of his wet clothing and into dry blankets. As she pulled him from the tent to make room for the paramedics who were racing to the scene, she felt something strange beneath the tent's floor. The texture was wrong, too rigid, too uniform. Her first thought was that Ray had created some kind of insulation platform, but as she examined it more closely, feeling the edges, she realized this was something deliberately constructed. The paramedics arrived at that moment, and her attention shifted to helping them assess Miller's condition. As they loaded Miller into the ambulance, Patricia made a decision. She needed to secure his belongings so they wouldn't be stolen by others in the encampment, a common problem. She began folding the tent when she noticed a seam that didn't look right. Against her better judgment, but driven by concern that whatever was under the floor might be important for his medical treatment, she carefully opened the seam. What she found made her gasp audibly. Vacuum-sealed packages, dozens of them, stacked in careful layers. She pulled out one package and saw, unmistakably, currency, $100 bills, thousands of them, maybe tens of thousands, sealed in plastic. Patricia immediately called the Portland Police Bureau. She stood guard over the tent, not allowing anyone near it until officers arrived 20 minutes later. Detectives Jake Morrison and Sarah Chen were the responding investigators. What they discovered as they carefully dismantled the tent's false floor would connect to an 8-year-old cold case and reveal one of the most unusual criminal disguises in Oregon history. The tent contained 32 packages of vacuum-sealed cash, totaling approximately $1.6 million. The money was in excellent condition, protected from moisture and decay by Miller's elaborate packaging. Serial numbers on random bills were immediately checked against FBI databases. By late afternoon on January 12th, Detective Morrison received confirmation that matched his suspicions. The serial numbers corresponded to currency stolen from the Northwest Regional Casino in April 1992. The homeless man they had just sent to the hospital was Raymond Deshawn Miller, one of the FBI's fugitives who had seemingly vanished into thin air 8 years earlier. The investigation moved rapidly. Detectives obtained a warrant for the storage unit, which they located by finding a key hidden in Miller's tent, along with a piece of paper bearing the facility's address and unit number. Inside the storage unit, they found an additional $147,000 in cash, along with Miller's original duffel bag, his casino employee ID badge, and documentation he had kept from his former life, including photographs of his daughters. At Emmanuel Hospital, Miller remained unconscious for 3 days as doctors treated his severe hypothermia and multiple other health issues related to his years of homelessness. When he finally regained consciousness on January 15th, FBI agents and Portland detectives were waiting. Miller's first words, according to the official report, were asking about Patricia Mendez. He wanted to know if she was in trouble for discovering his secret. When told she was fine and had potentially saved his life, he simply nodded and asked for a lawyer. The interrogation that followed, spread over several days as Miller's health stabilized, revealed the full scope of his elaborate deception. Miller provided detailed accounts of his planning, his execution of the theft, and his 8 years living homeless. Investigators were stunned by the discipline and commitment he had demonstrated. Miller explained his motivations, his crushing debt from his wife's medical bills, his sense of failure as a husband and father, his desperate belief that the money could somehow give his daughters the life his wife had wanted for them. He spoke about the psychological torture of living on the streets while sitting on a fortune, the constant fear of discovery, the isolation from everyone he loved. FBI forensic accountants eventually determined that of the original $1.8 million, approximately $1,747 million was recovered. Miller had spent only about $53,000 over 8 years, an average of less than $7,000 per year, most of which had gone to sending money to his daughters and basic survival expenses. It was an extraordinary example of restraint for someone with access to such wealth. The case against Miller was straightforward. He had committed theft, embezzlement, and fraud. He had evaded law enforcement for 8 years. Despite the sympathetic aspects of his story, the law was clear. In October 2000, Raymond Deshawn Miller pleaded guilty to all charges in exchange for a sentence recommendation of 15 years in federal prison. Miller's daughters attended the sentencing hearing. It was the first time they had seen their father in over 8 years. Both testified about the money orders they had received, which they now understood were from the stolen funds. They spoke about their father's love for their mother and his desperation after her death. They asked the judge for leniency. The judge, while acknowledging Miller's circumstances and the unusual nature of his crime and subsequent behavior, sentenced him to 12 years in federal prison with the possibility of parole after 8 years. In his remarks, the judge noted that Miller had shown extraordinary self-discipline, but had also made choices that harmed others and violated the law. The Northwest Regional Casino received full restitution of the recovered funds. Casino officials expressed satisfaction with the outcome but acknowledged that the theft had led to major changes in their security protocols and cash handling procedures. Patricia Mendez gave several interviews about her discovery. She spoke about how Ray had seemed different from others she encountered, how his intelligence and sadness had stood out, and how she never imagined the secret he was hiding. She continued her outreach work, but admitted the case had changed how she viewed everyone she tried to help. The Portland homeless community had mixed reactions. Some felt betrayed that one of their own had been hiding such wealth, while others suffered. Others argued that Miller had genuinely suffered alongside them and that his money hadn't made him any less cold or hungry on those freezing nights. Miller's case became a subject of discussion in law enforcement circles about the lengths criminals will go to evade capture and the psychological cost of maintaining false identities. Criminal justice professors used his case in classes about white-collar crime and fugitive behavior. Security consultants cited the casino theft in presentations about insider threats and the importance of multi-layered security protocols. In prison, Miller became a model inmate. He worked in the prison library, tutored other inmates in financial literacy, and maintained regular contact with his daughters, who eventually forgave him. He told fellow inmates that his years living homeless had been harder than prison, that at least in prison he had a bed and regular meals and didn't have to pretend to be someone else. Miller was released in 2010 after serving 10 years. His daughters, now in their 30s with families of their own, welcomed him back into their lives. He found work as an accountant for a small non-profit organization in Cleveland, living quietly and simply. He gave occasional interviews about his experience, always emphasizing the impossibility of truly escaping from one's choices and the price of every decision. The case of Raymond Deshawn Miller stands as a unique chapter in criminal history, a story of desperation, extreme discipline, and the ironic reality that someone could steal nearly $2 million, only to live in genuine poverty for 8 years to protect that fortune. It raises questions about desperation, morality, and the psychological limits of human endurance. For the FBI and Portland Police Bureau, the case served as a reminder that fugitives don't always run to distant countries or live in luxury. Sometimes they hide in the most unlikely places, enduring real hardship, trusting that no one will look for a millionaire among the homeless. For those who knew Ray during his years on the streets, the revelation remained shocking. The man they had shared meals with, worried about during cold nights, and tried to help, had been living a double life more extreme than any of them imagined. His tent, which once held his secret fortune, was eventually destroyed, but photographs of its ingenious false floor were used in FBI training materials as an example of elaborate concealment methods. The Morrison Bridge encampment, where Miller lived, has changed over the years, but people in Portland still occasionally tell the story of Ray, the homeless man who slept on $1 million, who chose cold concrete and hunger over capture, and whose secret was discovered only because someone cared enough to help him survive a winter storm. Raymond Deshawn Miller's story didn't end with his release from prison. The years that followed revealed the lasting impact of his choices, not just on himself, but on everyone connected to the case. His eldest daughter, Nicole, struggled for years with the knowledge that her college education had been funded by stolen money. She had graduated from Case Western Reserve University in 1998 with a degree in nursing, believing the money came from her mother's life insurance. When the truth emerged in 2000, she was forced to confront the fact that her achievements were built on her father's crime. She underwent therapy to process the guilt and anger, eventually reaching a place of understanding. In interviews given years later, she spoke about how her father's desperation to provide for them after their mother's death had driven him to make an unforgivable choice, but that she had come to see him as a flawed human being rather than simply a criminal. His younger daughter, Jasmine, took a different path. She had been only 14 when her father disappeared, and the abandonment had scarred her deeply. Even after his release, their relationship remained strained. She agreed to see him occasionally, but never fully forgave him for the years of lies and the shame his crime had brought to their family. She changed her last name in 2005, wanting to distance herself from the notoriety that followed the Miller name in Cleveland's tight-knit community. The Northwest Regional Casino, meanwhile, underwent massive changes in the wake of the theft and Miller's eventual capture. The counting room was completely redesigned with multiple redundant security measures. The casino hired a security consulting firm that implemented a buddy system for all cash handling procedures, ensuring that no single employee ever had unsupervised access to large amounts of currency. The casino's insurance company had paid out the loss in 1992, and when the money was recovered in 2000, a lengthy legal battle ensued over who was entitled to the recovered funds. Ultimately, the insurance company received the bulk of the recovery, with the casino receiving a portion for the costs incurred during the investigation and security upgrades. Thomas Whitmore, the senior finance manager who had discovered the theft back in 1992, had retired by the time Miller was caught. He gave one interview to the Oregonian newspaper in which he expressed a mixture of relief and sadness. Whitmore admitted that he had personally vouched for Miller during the hiring process, having been impressed by his credentials and his professional demeanor. The betrayal had haunted him throughout his career, and he confessed that he had never quite trusted anyone the same way after that April morning when he discovered the missing money. The FBI agents who had worked the case over the years had varying reactions to the resolution. Special Agent Linda Crawford, who had been the lead investigator from 1992 to 1995 before being transferred to another division, admitted in a later interview that she had been convinced Miller had fled to Mexico. The idea that he had remained in Portland, living as a homeless person, had never seriously been considered as a possibility. She acknowledged that the case had taught her a valuable lesson about assumptions in investigations and the importance of considering even the most unlikely scenarios. Detective Jake Morrison, who had been one of the first responders when Patricia Mendez discovered the money, went on to specialize in cold case investigations. He frequently referenced the Miller case in training sessions, using it to illustrate how criminals sometimes hide in plain sight by adopting personas that seem incompatible with wealth or sophistication. He noted that after Miller's arrest, there had been a brief period where Portland police looked more carefully at the city's homeless population, wondering if others might be hiding similar secrets. No other cases like Miller's were ever found. The storage facility where Miller had kept his emergency reserve became something of a minor tourist attraction for a brief period after the story broke. The facility's owner, who had rented the unit to Miller under a false name 8 years earlier, was interviewed extensively by media. He recalled Miller as unremarkable, a quiet man who paid cash and never caused problems. The owner admitted he felt foolish for not being more suspicious of someone paying a year in advance in cash, but noted that in the early 1990s, such transactions were less unusual than they would be today. Patricia Mendez, whose quick thinking and compassion had ultimately led to Miller's discovery, struggled with her role in the case. While she understood that she had done the right thing by calling the police, she felt conflicted about the fact that her attempt to help Ray had resulted in his arrest and imprisonment. She continued her work with Portland's homeless population, but became more aware of the complex stories and hidden lives that might exist among those she served. In a 2005 interview for a social work journal, she reflected that the Miller case had taught her that everyone, regardless of their circumstances, carries secrets and struggles that may never be visible to outsiders. The tent itself, the ingenious hiding place that had protected $1.6 million for 8 years, was preserved as evidence and eventually ended up in the FBI's training facility in Quantico, Virginia. It became part of a collection used to teach agents about concealment methods and the psychology of fugitives. Instructors would show the tent to new recruits, explaining the extraordinary discipline Miller had demonstrated and challenging them to think creatively about where fugitives might hide and how they might live. Miller's case also sparked discussions in academic and legal circles about the nature of punishment and redemption. Criminal psychology professors debated whether Miller's 8 years of voluntary suffering on the streets constituted a form of self-imposed punishment that should have been considered during sentencing. Legal scholars discussed whether the fact that he had spent so little of the stolen money and that most of it was recovered should have resulted in a more lenient sentence. These debates continued long after Miller's release, with no clear consensus emerging. In Portland's homeless community, the story of Ray became something of a legend. Years after the discovery, people would still occasionally reference the man who had slept on $1 million. Some used his story as evidence that not everyone on the streets was what they appeared to be. Others saw it as a cautionary tale about the impossibility of escaping one's past, no matter how elaborate the disguise.